The Harvard Graduate School of Education, working at the nexus of practice, policy, and research.
It's my pleasure to welcome you to this Asquith Forum. The provocative topic of the evening is New Orleans education reform, pass or fail. I assume there are some options somewhere in between those two stark alternatives, but this is primarily an opportunity to really engage in some discussion, debate about what we know about the effects of reforms taking place in New Orleans post-Katrina. Just out of curiosity, how many people in the room have had an opportunity to visit New Orleans post-Katrina, to look at schools? A lot. How many people took that opportunity prior to Katrina to ever visit New Orleans to look at schools? More than we would have guessed. I mean, it's interesting that New Orleans, because of the post-Katrina reforms, has probably been, certainly one of the 2 or 3 cities in the country where education reformers have been most engaged in trying to kind of understand the reforms and come to some sort of rough early judgment, at least about their effects. We are fortunate to have on the panel this evening someone who's been right in the center of that work in New Orleans, and someone who has written provocatively, taking a look from the outside at the effect of those reforms. To guide us through this discussion, we have, I'm thinking of the right term for Andy Rotherham. Recidivist might be one. He has come back now several times to moderate panels here at the Ed School. We think of him as a member of this community. He is a member of the visiting committee for the Graduate School of Education, but obviously best known for his work nationally, both as a columnist on education for Time Magazine, as the author of a widely read blog called EduWonk, and because of his leadership role in a variety of organizations. We first met in the second term of the Clinton administration when he was in the White House as Clinton's education advisor on the domestic policy staff. He's also served on the Virginia Board of Education, currently co-founder and co-leader of an organization called Bellwether. I never remember what comes after it. Bellwether Education Partners. So without further ado, I will turn the podium over to Andy.
Thanks, It's great to be here. So welcome to everybody in the room. Welcome to everybody who's watching online, and welcome in advance to people who are going to watch the archive video later. Jason, what's the hashtag for people who are following along on Twitter? Asquith. So hashtag Asquith if you want to send in a question, and Jason will relay it up to us. If you are watching online, you can communicate with us through Twitter. So we're really excited about this forum. So a couple weeks ago, I think some of you are here, we did a really fun one on the NFL and what schools can learn from the NFL. And we had Dominique Foxworth, an NFL cornerback and head of the Players Association, and Brendan Daly, who coaches for the Vikings, and his brother, and probably placed brother, Tim Daly, who leads the New Teacher Project. And so this week we're going to do New Orleans, where as far as I know, they don't want to talk about the NFL at all. But they do want to talk about schools, and I'm really excited. We have a really great panel. I think it'll be a lively conversation. I think we all know the basic contours of what happened in August of 2005 with this terrible storm, followed by a really catastrophic flood. And I think everybody watched, everybody wanted to help. People did pitch in and help in different ways. There's a lot of love for the city because a lot of people have just, great, you saw all the hands here, just great memories of spending time in New Orleans and just what a wonderful city it was, and wanted to make sure it became a wonderful city again. But the disruption and the need to rebuild obviously set in motion a fascinating set of education reforms, and that's what we're here to look at today. And there's a lot of strong views. You've heard a lot of stuff, and we were really excited to be able to get a panel together with someone who's actually studying the work and someone who's actually doing the work, to sort of get underneath some of the rhetoric and figure out what's actually happened down there, what are some of the lessons, what needs to happen next, what would people do differently, lessons learned, all those kinds of things. So just brief introductions. Kristen Buras is an assistant professor at Georgia State University in Atlanta. She's also associate editor of the Journal of Education Policy. She received her doctorate from the University of Wisconsin. She's published a number of books and articles and so forth. Her next book is tentatively called Bamboozled: Why the Charter School Experiment in New Orleans Will Fail the Nation. So that'll give you a little sense of where she's going to come from. Sarah Usdin is founder and CEO of New Schools for New Orleans, so that'll give you a little sense of where she's going to come from. She formed NSNO in the aftermath of Katrina. Sarah married into a Louisiana family and was living in New Orleans. She formed NSNO to help and assist in the recovery efforts with the schools down in New Orleans. She graduated from Colgate, but she holds a master's in curriculum instruction from LSU, so that makes her somewhat authentic, right? Sarah spent the last 18 years in education. After a Fulbright, she was with Teach for America and then was partner at the New Teacher Project. I should say, in the interest of full disclosure, my firm, Bellwether, the nonprofit consulting firm that, as Bob mentioned, I'm a partner at, has done some work for New Schools in New Orleans on some strategy work and so forth, so I should just mention that. So quickly, before we get into the conversation, I just want to establish some facts, because I think it's just really hard for people who don't follow this closely. It's such a complicated situation. So just quickly, either one of you, before the storm, what was the population in New Orleans? City, yeah, the population, all people, adults, kids.
$1 million plus.
$1 million plus?
About 75% now.
Okay, so it's about 75% back to that, great. And how many teachers, how many kids in the schools?
66,000 kids or so. Having worked in the school system, they didn't know how many teachers they employed.
So 66,000 kids. Okay, rough idea, any rough count on teachers?
I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that sort of sets up, what were the schools like before the storm? I mean, we've had a lot of attention to them. Just quickly, what was the state of the New Orleans public schools prior to the storm?
I think that's a really important question. I think one of my concerns has been that many of the reports that are coming out on the schools now, sort of the current reforms, don't really take a historical perspective on New Orleans public schools. Very often when they talk about pre-Katrina, they go back to maybe 1996 or 1997. And I guess I want to just make a few very quick comments on pre-Katrina New Orleans that I find to be relevant to the current reforms. Because one of the things that's happened is that the argument has been made that we needed these reforms because New Orleans public schools were in the state they were in due to mismanagement. And I think that that is a very ahistorical point of view. So we think about New Orleans public schools, for most of their history, they were intended to be the property of Southern whites and not to serve the African American community. In 1900, it was decided that African American public schools would only go grades 1st through 5th grade. There was terribly poor facilities, overcrowding, inequitable pay between black and white teachers, and gross segregation. New Orleans didn't have its first high school for African Americans until 1916. And before that had to be struggled over, of course, remember the grades K through 5? They had to get the bridge grades 6, 7, and 8. So fight for that, and then the first high school in 1916. The second high school wasn't even built until the mid-40s. There was gross inequitable pay between black and white teachers. In the mid to late 30s, a white teacher with a BA and 10 years of experience made approximately $2,200 a year, and an African American teacher with the same experience made about $1,400.
Okay, well, Kristen, I don't think anyone in the audience needs a primer on how bad education was for blacks in the South.
Well,
and New Orleans sort of led the way. But help us understand,
okay.
Help us get up to the conversation now. How did we get to sort of where things were in the early part of the last decade before the storm? What was the situation before this catastrophe? So the relationship
between the history that I just sort of detailed and the current reforms is that this history of racialized oppression and segregation contributed to mass disinvestment in the public schools, so that after Brown v. Board of Education in 1954, right, there was mass white flight. Between 1950 and the year 2000, New Orleans as a city lost 2/3 of its white population due to white flight. And as a result of that, and the remaining public schools being largely African American, there was gross disinvestment.
And what percentage of kids also were in private schools, though? So help us understand the landscape before the storm, because it's significantly higher.
About a third. About a third of, the vast majority of white students, right, were in the public schools. They then fled to the suburbs after the 50s to go to public schools, or stayed in the city and went to parochial schools. There's a long history of Catholic education in the city of New Orleans. And so these majority black schools, that history of racialized disinvestment continued. And so I guess the context I'm trying to provide is that we think about the need for current reforms. I don't find the discourse around the mismanagement of schools to be an adequate explanation for the dire conditions that existed pre-Katrina, but rather, again, the racialized disinvestment produced the dismal achievement scores that we saw in the public schools of the city. And I think that this is just a really crucial point to keep in mind.
And talk a little bit more then about what was the situation. So you've talked about this history, and which really is, I think everybody would agree, a pretty atrocious history, and unfortunately is not unique to New Orleans,
Right.
how we got there. So what was the situation like sort of right before the storm? Just to help people understand, like just a snapshot, what do we know about graduation rates, finances, these sorts of things?
The 10 years before the storm, Dr. Buras and I would agree, was an abysmal school system. The numbers speak for themselves. It was 68th out of 60 parishes in the state. Louisiana is not the highest flying state in the nation in terms of academic achievement, so we were, one could argue, the worst parish county in the nation. We did have 8 superintendents in 10 years, 5 different CFOs between the years of 99 and 2005. The feds were threatening to take away all of the federal money in Orleans Parish because of mismanagement at the district office. We had dead people who had received paychecks, not just 1 or 2 paychecks, but several years worth of paychecks, to the tune of $3 million of salary and benefits going to people who had not been taken off the rolls. That was when I said we didn't know how many teachers taught, the rolls weren't clean. So there was, I like to say that there was moral, financial, and academic bankruptcy, and most important is that academic bankruptcy. We had abysmally failed the students in our schools. In Orleans Parish has the second highest percentage of students attending private and parochial schools in the nation. Jefferson Parish, the neighboring parish where Dr. Buras grew up, has the highest percentage of students. Anyone who could, black or white, got their kids out of the public school system and into a private or parochial school.
So right before the storm, what sort of reform efforts? You talked about the feds were talking about pulling out. There was a private firm called Alvarez and Marcel that does sort of forensic accounting that had been brought in, trying to figure out where some of the money was. Like, what kinds of stuff was going on? What was the state doing? What reform efforts were in place prior to the storm? And then we'll talk about after the storm.
Yeah.
Like, what kind of stuff was going on?
I think that's important. I mean, one thing I think we could mention is one of the reforms, if you will, that happened before Katrina that a lot of people don't realize is, in fact, the Recovery School District. Many people think of the RSD as, and when I say RSD, we're talking about Recovery School District, think of it as a state entity that was created after Katrina. It was actually created before Katrina. It required a state constitutional amendment to create it. There was a lot of contention around its creation. But in 2003, it was pushed through, largely at the behest of Leslie Jacobs, a former member of the State Board of Education, and allies within the state legislature. And it was expressly and publicly avowed that it was created for the purposes of remediating the failure in New Orleans public schools. But it didn't do very much before Katrina.
But how? Like, so how was it? What was it intended? How was it? How did it work?
The intention was we've had schools that for generations and for years on end had failed students, and that you were going to keep the students in the building, keep the families connected to the building, and find someone new to run the building.
So it's it was a turnaround initiative.
In essence, Leslie Jacobs was the architect behind it. She was a business person, and it was a Chapter 11 for a school, and it was, as Dr. Buras said, absolutely for academic failure.
One of the interesting things, though, is that even though the Recovery School District is a statewide entity, that particular entity, and we'll talk about this post-Katrina, it's sort of a misnomer to call it a statewide entity because it was really intended to target African-American schools in New Orleans. And if we look post-Katrina, and I won't say too much, I'll save a little bit for later, but if we look post-Katrina at the actions of the RSD, we'll see that 80% of the schools that the Recovery School District has taken over are either in Orleans Parish or East Baton Rouge, and those are the two sort of black strongholds of public education in the state. And so even though this entity was presumably created to rectify failure, right, it did not take over failing schools in other parts of the state. It selectively and strategically took over schools, largely in Orleans Parish, after the storm came through.
Okay, let's hold on to that before the
Sure.
storm. So one other question, you hear a lot about selective schools. Like, what was the story on public school selectivity in New Orleans prior to Katrina?
There were a handful of citywide access schools. There have been large struggles over the magnet school system. There were programs within schools. Quite honestly, the Recovery School District, when it was passed, and we'll get into the after Katrina, the only schools that were educating kids we were only educating smart kids. We were educating any kid that could test to get into a school. And those were the schools then that remained with the Orleans Parish School Board.
And were they more diverse racially, those schools, than other
Yes.
schools? Okay.
Yes.
Than the average school there. Okay. So August 2005, the storm comes. Just first of all, just in terms of the physical infrastructure, like what was the effect of the sort of the net? Before we get into sort of staffing and all that, just what was the effect of the natural disaster on the schools?
I chuckle because prior to the storm, we needed $1 billion worth of infrastructure improvements, and post-storm, we needed $1.2 billion. You all saw the pictures. You saw the horrific images. The buildings were in horrible disrepair prior and after. The difference was that after the storm, whatever building had a roof on it didn't have water in it. We needed to absolutely get a school up and running as quickly as possible in any facility that we could in order to bring families and children and students home and to start rebuilding our city.
And 80% of the schools were affected in one way or another, and to one degree or another, by the storm.
And when you say affected, physically affected in terms
Precisely.
of, okay, what happened to people? So, you had a lot of people relocated to other cities, particularly places like Houston, Atlanta, and so forth. What happened with students and what happened with faculty and school administrators and so forth in the aftermath of the storm?
Yeah, I think that's such an important question. I think that what happened in the days after Katrina hit on August 29th of 2005, I think it's criminal. The level of government abandonment of working class and poor African Americans in the city. And it's very clear that George Bush and his administration were very aware that people did not have a way out of the city, and yet people were left there. And so in some ways, what we saw the days after Katrina is emblematic of this ongoing process of abandonment and neglect that I'm talking about. That said, people who could afford to remove themselves, thereafter people were rescued, right, and scattered to the four winds across the country. I think what's significant in terms of the precision and scope of the reforms and the changing of the public school governance model in just a few months after Katrina is really the key question that you're asking. And so very quickly, I'll say that, just 2 months after Katrina hit, in November of 2005, Governor Kathleen Blanco called a special legislative session. And during that special legislative session, she passed what was called Act 35. And this particular legislation redefined what counted as a failing school. So New Orleans or Louisiana has what they call SPS, or school performance scores. And these are largely driven by students' performance on the state standardized test called the LEAP, okay, the Louisiana Educational Assessment Program. And so kids take the test and they come up with these school performance scores. Well, and they set the test score cutoff. Well, when Katrina hit, the SPS cutoff for a failing school was 60. What Act 35 did is it redefined what counted as a failing school, and it dramatically thrust upward the definition of failure so that the SPS score cutoff went from 60 to 87.4, which was just below the state average.
And that's a pass rate of number of students in the school passing?
Yes.
Okay.
And it should be noted that that's a 0 to 200 scale. So the New Orleans schools were so abysmal that the way to get the Recovery School District legislation passed required a 60 cutoff. When the storm hit, Governor Blanco, who was a Democrat and a teacher by training, she loved teachers, recognized that something had to happen very different in the city, and to try and rebuild the system. And the cutoff score was changed to the state average. And let me remind you, Louisiana's state average is still not rivaling that of Massachusetts or California.
And so then this
Right,
is an index just before.
Correct.
So this if it's going to so it's an index based on pass rates.
Right.
Okay. And one before we get into a little more of this, just help immediately after the storm. You said the population is back to 75%. What was the
No,
student
no,
population?
not at that point.
Right. So
But
no.
it's
Now
for
I'm saying
sure.
now it's back to 75%. In the immediate aftermath of the storm, what was the student population back to? Just
So
what would-
in the immediate aftermath of the storm, all the buildings are shuttered, families are scattered across the country. The Orleans Parish School Board announces that they will not open school that year. And so for teachers and principals and families who want to come home and rebuild their lives and get back to school, that's an unacceptable answer. As Dr. Buras explained, the Recovery School District legislation had been passed in 2003, and a handful of schools, one of them led by Sharon Clark, veteran Orleans Parish teacher and principal, said, well, that's not an acceptable response. Her families were calling her, when's school going to open, Ms. Clark, how are we going to get going? And because she had already been chartered as part of the Recovery School District and was able to reach out to all the teachers who had been on her staff, she got her school up and running very quickly. Similarly, on the West Bank, when schools were dry and those schools were uncovered, Brian Reidlinger, who was also a veteran administrator in the Orleans Parish School Board, and Orleans Parish School Board members who were displeased with the board's decision not to open schools, seeded and created the Algiers Charter Network as a mechanism to get families.
That's what I was going to ask. So, like
Right.
these people were opening schools. How were they?
They used the charter mechanism
They were
to
just
do
okay.
so.
But see, to me, this is the untold story of educational reform in New Orleans, and it's this. You know, the mandate to charter these schools didn't start at the state or local level. It was a federal mandate. Just days after Katrina hit, the Conservative Heritage Foundation put out a report basically saying that we need to create a Gulf opportunity zone that is going to be driven by market-based educational reforms. And when you saw Bush sort of giving his speech with that eerie blue essence sort of behind him in front of the cathedral, I mean, he could have just lifted his words out of the Heritage Foundation report. He advocated these kind of market-based sort of zoning of the South.
But did this happen? But I'm confused. Did this happen by under the state law, or did it happen under a federal provision?
I guess what I'm saying is that you know, based on a range of interviews I've done with stakeholders, that basically there was a federal mandate, that it was clearly communicated to Kathleen Blanco, that New Orleans schools were going to be subjected to charterization, and that if they did not move in that direction, that Louisiana would not get disaster rebuilding money. And hence comes Act 35, where in order, so the issue is, how do we control Orleans public schools?
Okay, hang on. So that's a pretty serious charge.
Right.
You're saying the federal government said, if you don't charter your schools, we're going to withhold disaster aid?
I'm saying that based on oral histories that I did of people who were out and about in Baton Rouge at the time, and in conversation with Kathleen Blanco, that the understanding was that the federal government was leveraging its power to make New Orleans the charter school experiment of the nation. And we know that the federal government poured millions of dollars in the 10 months following Katrina, but the stipulation was these federal monies must be used to rebuild the schools, but only along the lines of a charter school experiment. Now, the question was, how was that going to happen? And that's why I was mentioning Act 35. At the SPS 60, only 13 of 128 schools could have been defined as failing. You can't take over non-failing schools, right? And so by upwardly moving the SPS cutoff to 87.4, the Recovery School District was then able to take over 107 of 128 schools in Orleans Parish. Simultaneously, and I point this out to say that these actions, in my view, and based on my research, were not benevolent. So for example, while people were displaced, and actually if you could call up slide 2, please.
And hang on that, just on that number of schools, was that a number of actual functioning schools at that point, or in the wake of the storm, or some of those schools? So you said 105 schools? Was that 105 operating schools?
No, those were the entities that would be soon back up and running as people return.
Okay, okay.
Exactly. And so basically, with this school takeover, simultaneously, Kathleen Blanco, the governor, also passed 2 executive orders. This was Executive Order 58 and 79, what these did was they overturned particular aspects of charter school law that said that in order to charter a school, you required parental, faculty, and community input. Well, those aspects of the law were suspended after Katrina, and the schools were taken over. And so I share a quote from a long-term Black veteran teacher who conceived of these reforms in the following way. They came back and said, oh, you no longer have jobs. The district no longer exists. We're going to split it up, make some charters. The state's going to take control of everything. I asked one state legislator, how could you do that with us being displaced and still abide by open meetings law? Because when you do stuff like that, you have to post notice. You have to invite the public. You have to get their input. He said, well, what we did was we called up a few people that we knew were back in town and invited them over to my house, and we sat down and began to dismantle the district. The teacher says the following: this is the kind of underhanded tactics that were going on while our family members were still floating in the waters of Katrina, while our school children were still floating in that water.
Okay, well, I want to hang on. So, Sarah, do you want to? Because I want to get some clarity on this union question, which you hear a lot of stuff about, which is sort of implicit in your slide. Before that, I'm sort of stunned that, I mean, obviously the Bush administration was in favor of charters. Sort of anyone who doesn't get that, you're probably in the wrong forum. But this idea that they came in and basically blackmailed the state on this.
I didn't say blackmailed. I said that.
Yeah, well,
I guess I'd like to chime in as somebody who was actually in the Capitol when this was occurring, and watching different communities come together. As I alluded to, the actual action of many schools to cede from the Orleans Parish School District had started prior to Katrina. One school literally on Friday, what would have been Monday's the 29th, somebody do the math for me, my kids always tell me I'm bad with math. On Friday, her school had literally had a vote saying we want to become a charter school. The Algiers charter networks had been figuring out how do we get away from this district. And they had drafted that legislation. Some of the magnet schools had begun the process prior to any of this to talk about it. And I was actually working in the Capitol at the time that Act 35 was passed, helped to get that legislation passed. There was actually never any mention of the, I mean, I was in the Chief of Staff's office. There was never any mention of the Heritage Foundation or of anything coming in from the White House. It was really, we need to get schools open. Teachers and principals were calling and wondering if the board's not going to open, can we still get a charter approved by the state board, because we want to get teachers back to work and we want to have a place for kids to go to school so that parents can get their houses rebuilt.
But of course, they didn't want to get teachers back, any old teacher back to work. You know, in late 2005, New Orleans public school teachers, who constituted a huge proportion of the city's black middle class, were informed that they were going to be fired en masse in early 2006, and they were. And so I guess.
Yeah, what happened with that? That's why I wanted to get out the question. So what happened with
the?
Because the teachers' unions say that the union was sort of broken in this process. Lots of teachers were laid off, and people. So help us, both of you. Sort of, you obviously have different takes on this, but if you both sort of share what happened there, because there's lots of conflicting narratives. It's kind of hard to know what happened.
The instability and chaos. I mean, I don't know if any. That reigned in a city after the worst federal disaster is sort of hard to fathom. You know, it's amazing. Any of you all who are moms out there and you don't remember how painful labor was now because you had to go through it again. It's like we can't, as New Orleanians, you became desensitized to how chaotic it was. It was a Western Union telegram that was sent to all the teachers. It was awful. Should never have been handled in the way that it was handled. The board didn't have any schools. It wasn't going to open schools. There was no way, there was no tax revenue coming in through the city's coffers. There was no way to keep employing folks. And quite honestly, it was not handled in the way that it should have been handled, but there was no way to employ the X number of teachers that had been there before.
Again, I think there's an alternative narrative that really does merit very serious consideration. We're talking about teachers, black teachers largely, unionized teachers, who had worked in despicable conditions for decades, trying to educate the children of New Orleans. This was not simply about getting schools back up and running after disaster. I mean, imagine, if you could call up slide 3, imagine your neighborhood looking like the picture you're about to show. Isn't that the juncture at which every community member should have been engaged in a process of talking about how to rebuild homes, how to rebuild neighborhoods, and how to rebuild public schools? I mean, this could have been, a catalytic moment for community input on how to truly reform what Sarah and I both agree was a failing public school system. But the problem is it was done behind the backs of the very community it was supposed to serve. And the community will tell you this. If you talk to parents and veteran teachers and community elders and grassroots activists, they will tell you that this has been an anti-democratic takeover of public institutions in their communities. And the notion that we couldn't continue to employ these teachers is just not true. At the current time, there is a wrongful termination class action lawsuit that is underway. It involves 7,000 certified and tenured public school teachers in the city of New Orleans who are claiming that they were fired under duress, that they were wrongly terminated. The attorneys describe state and local education officials' actions as arbitrary, capricious, and unreasonable, and intended to carry out an old political agenda to replace New Orleans public schools with quasi-private charter schools.
Well, how many of these teachers are back? I just to try to, how many, I mean.
But wait, there's one other key element that I just want to mention about this, which is that Orleans Parish School Board actually had business interruption insurance that would have covered the salaries of these veteran educators until they came back. That insurance was not used, and the fact that they had that insurance was not disclosed to the attorneys, nor was it disclosed to the court. Instead, and here's the irony, while on one hand we're told that the state can't afford to pay veteran teachers, at the very same moment there are conversations unfolding in the months after Katrina in Washington, D.C. at the Aspen Institute talking about, we can't afford these teachers. They're expensive. They have health insurance, and they're growing an aging population. They have pensions and so forth. We need to reconstruct human capital in the city of New Orleans. We need to bring in TFAers. They won't expect health insurance or pensions, and they will come and they will do this service for a few years in New Orleans until they decide what they really want to do with their lives. And so, interestingly, you should know that many of the veteran educators in the city were actually, sort of after their dismissal, were replaced by a large infusion of teachers from Teach for America and New Teacher Project.
Yeah, and I want to talk about that. Hang on to that. But let me ask you a question. I'm the moderator. I get to ask the questions. So who at the Aspen Institute said that? That's actually, that's said that these conversations were on. Like, who did you interview at the Aspen Institute who sort of talked about that?
Well, I interviewed individuals who were present at the Aspen Institute gatherings and who were privy to these conversations. And you should know that the president of the Aspen Institute, Walter Isaacson, is a native New Orleanian. He long rode for the Times-Picayune before he became CEO of CNN. So there's some New Orleans connections there too.
And editor of Time.
Right, but there's a monetary connection here that
But hang on, but who, who like confirmed, that this is, because this is, I was actually in some of those conversations. I'm a fellow at the Aspen Institute. I never heard this. And so I'm curious, like in sort of the interviews, like who was there, like said this? Because again, these are like really serious allegations.
Well, based on informed consent, which is institutionally required, I don't.
But were these people who were actually in the room?
These were people who were at the various gatherings in DC when different sort of foundations were having conversations about how the New Orleans experiment was going to unfold. And you know what, even if these people weren't privy to these conversations, the facts speak for themselves. New Orleans teachers were fired en masse, and a huge cohort
Right, and
of
I
TFAers
want
were
to hang on. So, like, first of all, how many teachers who, and again, I
Yeah.
agree, it seems to be a little hard to get the number on exactly how many teachers there were prior to the storm, but so, with the caveat that these are a rough estimate,
Sure.
like, what percentage of teachers who are now teaching in New Orleans were teaching in New Orleans before the storm?
You know,
And if you can't even give a percentage, like, oh, many, some, a lot, a little, like, help us understand.
I mean, some of the first schools to open after Katrina, Doris Roche Hicks in the lower Ninth Ward got Martin Luther King School up and running. She employed most of the teachers she had employed prior to Katrina to get that school open. Sharon Clark, one of the first charters in the Recovery School District, same thing. It very much is dependent on the school and the school community. The Orleans board was not facilitating anything. And so the veteran...
Can you give an estimate? I mean, there are definitely compelling stories of veteran educators and compelling anecdotes, but any kind of estimate of...
You know, Andy, I mean, literally, they were paying folks who were dead, right? So we don't know how many folks... It is now that John White and Patrick Dobard are beginning to get good... Who are the super... John was the superintendent of the Recovery School District. He's now our state superintendent, and Patrick is the current RSD superintendent, that are actually getting a grasp on all of the data. And
what's the status with the union now? Like, are these teachers working under a contract? Is there no union? What's
No.
Some
as
are.
we move into this conversation about post the storm, like what's the status with that now?
Some are, some aren't.
Okay, and what's the determining factor?
The charters get to choose whether or not they want to unionize, and the Recovery School District has not, and
Yeah.
some of the Orleans schools are.
And is there a master contract still in?
No, there is
Okay.
not, because the New Orleans school system was sort of reconstructed along new lines, right? What happened is that the collective bargaining agreement collapsed because the entity with which the agreement existed was reconstituted. But again, none of this was accidental. And there are a range of statements by public officials along these very lines. So Paul Vallis, who for several years was the superintendent of the Recovery School District, has publicly stated on multiple occasions that he doesn't want any of his teachers working for longer than 10 years because that's not what he calls a sustainable system. And he's referring to the costs. And so I guess for some of these folks, they just think that public education should have a revolving door of teachers. But of course, these are not anyone's children who are being taught by inexperienced TFAers. These are poor and working class black children.
What percentage are TNTP
Okay.
and what percentage are TFA?
Yeah, so I have some percentages
yeah.
here, and I think that's what you're asking.
Yeah,
and I
exactly.
think these are really crucial. So in 2005, before Katrina, only 10% of the teachers in the city had 1 to 2 years of experience. In 2008, 33% were in their first or second year of teaching. In 2007 and 2008, 60% of the teachers in the RSD state-run schools had 1 year or less experience, and 41% of the teachers in the RSD charter schools had 0 to 3 years of experience. On the other side, the few schools that had been left under the control of the Orleans Parish School Board, some 47% of those teachers had 25 plus years of experience. And it varied school by school. I mean, there are some charter schools that had upwards of 90% teachers who were in their first, second, or third year of teaching.
And the obvious counterfactual here, which I'll ask both of you, is like in the wake of the storm, like, and again, it's an unknowable counterfactual, but like, what percentage of those people were necessary because you needed people to do the work and they were trying to bring them down, and what percentage sort of could have been filled with effective teachers who were there previously? Again, with the caveat that we don't have great numbers and it was a very chaotic situation, just your informed views. I mean, how should we be thinking about this?
So in 2006, I was starting up new schools for New Orleans, and one of the things is we went around and we interviewed all of the principals who had schools open and who were opening schools. What is your number one need? And they said teachers. Folks were doing everything to help people know how to connect. There was no central clearinghouse. It was a lot of shoe leather to go check out. And to know you went into a school that you thought was an elementary, but it was a high school because it was the only dry building around. And so things that were radically different. And so we at New Schools for New Orleans, based off of that information from school leaders, went and contracted with the New Teacher Project. In fact, begged the New Teacher Project to come and reinstitute the program of Teach NOLA that they had run at Orleans Parish before. The New Teacher Project was pretty hesitant to do so. And in fact, it was some of their employees who really said, this is our moral obligation to go help ensure that there will be teachers, enough teachers, to help get schools up and running. And the very first years that TNTP was recruiting for Teach NOLA, over 60% of those teachers were teachers who were from the local area and region, and it had given them a central clearinghouse of how to get back. Some of them with experience, some of them had been in private and parochial schools, had always wanted to work in the public school system, but couldn't because the Orleans Parish School Board, and I know this because I found a box of 2,000 applications that no one ever had processed at the Orleans Parish School Board in a closet when I worked there one time. They just weren't handling their HR office very well. And so it gave folks a way to come back. Now, I will say that those numbers have flopped, right? Now, it's,
what do you mean flopped?
When I say it was more local and regional people coming in through Teach NOLA in the beginning years because they needed a place to be able to clear and come into schools and connect with schools. We were totally decentralized. It was very confusing. And now TNTP is still recruiting. It's actually a point of stress because we raise money to help philanthropically bring them into the schools. And the schools, when we say we want to get rid of the Teach NOLA program, the schools, some of those that are the highest performing, and I think we need to get into some academic results.
We're going to soon.
But some of the highest performing schools ask us to continue those
it sounds like,
programs.
to summarize, it sounds like you're saying they were needed, and Kristen, you're saying that they were not. Is that sort of?
Yeah.
And before we move into performance, and actually, what slide? Could you call? Kristen has a great slide. Slide number 4. What?
The academic achievement?
No, we're going to get to that, but now I want this governance slide.
Oh, that's great.
But why we're calling it so? Yeah. And I'm trying to sort of. I know you think sort of when we look at culprits here, and I hate to look at culprits, but it's part of every story needs a villain, and there's villains. You're blaming the Bush administration and some outside folks. You seem to be laying a lot of blame on the Orleans Parish and the way the schools are run previously. Sort of, what's your take on sort of the role of the Orleans?
Yeah, actually, let me clarify my position.
No, not Sarah's. Kristen's slide 4. Sorry.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Kristen's slide 4. Let me clarify my position if I can. I'm not singularly blaming the Bush administration. What I'm hoping to convey is that there were actors at the federal, state, and local level who had an interest, sometimes overlapping concerns, sometimes disparate, but who had a shared commitment to marketizing the public schools of New Orleans. And we could talk about, the actors at each level.
Right. But sorry, that's what I was sort of.
Yeah.
I was a little. That's what I was getting at. What, in your view, though, what's the culpability of the Orleans school district and everything that happened? I mean, we talk about this. This termination of the teachers, the schools. Like, in your view, what's the culpability there?
So I guess my concern about culpability is that when we look at the reforms that have been unfolding, that there are a number of sort of elite stakeholders, right, who have come in with, to use Sarah's word, sort of a moral commitment. But I question that.
Right, before you question that, just is the Orleans School District blameless here, or like what's their role? I'm pretty clear on Sarah's take on them, which isn't very positive. I'm interested in sort of in yours.
Well, again, I think the focus on the corruption of the Orleans Parish School Board in the years immediately leading up to 2005, again, is a very...
No, I mean after the storm, with like the decision to close the schools, to fire the teachers. Do they have blame here? And I'm just trying to sort of surface the competing narratives here.
So a simple answer would be no, because the RSD, the state-run RSD as an entity, became the governing force over the schools in Orleans Parish. And in many ways, much as the union had been disbanded, in many ways the Orleans Parish School Board had been equally weakened and only left with really a handful of schools.
So their decision to say we're not going to open schools this year, that was defensible?
I'm unaware of a decision to say we're not going to open schools this year. If anything, State Superintendent Cecil Picard is the person I understood who had that agenda. He was, again, was the state superintendent.
And I may have heard it wrong. Did you said, okay, sorry, okay. Because I'm not, I mean, I'm genuinely asking questions here because I want to know. I'm not a deep expert on this.
And I think part of the tension here too, Andy, that's substantial to understand, is that right now there's a huge struggle between over governance of the public schools. And so Orleans Parish School Board is a locally elected entity. The State Board of Education, which is called the Board of Elementary and Secondary Education, BESE in New Orleans, is a statewide board. It is not wholly elected, and I think maybe only one official on the board actually has direct
So who actually fired the teachers then? You said they got this Western Union telegram. Like, these teachers were under contract to the school, okay,
right.
to the school board, and so the school board let these teachers go. So who's the lawsuit against?
Well, it's interesting because the lawsuit of the class action lawsuit is against Orleans Parish School Board, the Recovery School District, the Louisiana Department of Education, and the Board of Elementary and Secondary Education. However, Orleans Parish School Board has filed a countersuit saying we're not completely responsible for the firing of the teachers because the Recovery School District had assumed control of 107 of 128 schools in Orleans Parish, and so we couldn't employ our teachers back in those schools because we no longer controlled those entities.
And so if you're an RSD school in that situation,
Yes.
then who at that point is employing the teachers? The RSD or the parish? How does that work?
Well, the
State of
recovery.
Louisiana.
The state of Louisiana at that point is employing
Yes.
them? Okay.
Correct. The
And-
Recovery School District is a department of
And so you at that point become an employee of the state instead of?
Right,
Okay.
and the trick to that and the reprehensible criminal dispossession of black veteran teachers in the city of New Orleans is the following. If I'm a black veteran teacher and I've been teaching for 20 or 30 years in the city of New Orleans, and I come in under the Recovery School District, I am treated as a year one employee in terms of vestment. I start all over again trying to build up vestment for health insurance, pension, and so forth.
Do you lose your pension?
Well,
how does that work?
This is so, it's so complicated to explain in
But if you're a veteran teacher and
Yeah.
you go into the RSD, do you potentially lose your pension? Is that what you're saying?
In some ways, you effectively lose your accrued benefits because the Orleans Parish School Board system, the schools under that system were gutted. The insurance pool became considerably smaller, and so insurance premiums threatened to skyrocket for the teachers who remained in the system. I mean, at one point, premiums were up to $1,200 a month. I was told a story where two elderly teachers who had taught for 32 years went in November 2005 to talk to state legislators. It was later than that, I'm sorry, to talk to state legislators about trying to remediate this huge health insurance problem that Orleans Parish school teachers were going through, and nothing happened. And so, just at every level.
Okay, but there's a difference.
Yeah.
You don't actually lose. There's a difference between something becoming fiscally untenable or having your pension taken away. And so I'm trying. They didn't actually have their pensions taken away. It just became the finance of the district became. It sounds like became untenable because there were so few teachers.
It was untenable even before.
Oh, that hardly would make. Unfortunately, that would hardly make New Orleans unique in that circumstance.
Correct.
But
I guess what I'm saying is that as things got reconstituted, people lost sick leave, they lost vacation time, health insurance premiums skyrocketed, and they no longer had the option of remaining in the system into which they had been vested and to continuing build up tenure in that system.
so they couldn't continue to get further benefits of that system if they didn't lose. Okay,
no.
so as we switch to this slide that you had, Kristen, your slides on
Yes.
governance, I thought was really good. Could someone, one of the two of you guys can see it here. It's roughly big enough up here. Just quickly help people understand. This is a governance disaster. So help people understand, like, how does this actually work in practice? What are we looking at?
Sort of a shorter way of doing it. This is this is the researcher, this is the practitioner. So my on-the-ground experience is that the Recovery School District is a department of the Louisiana Department of Education, And under the Louisiana Department of Education and the Recovery School District, there are both chartered schools and directly operated schools. So there's charter and directly operated under the Recovery School District. They are part of the Department of Education. That is the majority of schools in Louisiana.
That's sort of the left half, if you will.
In New Orleans, those are the schools that only 35% of the kids were on grade level prior to Katrina. The schools that the Orleans Parish School District kept were those magnet schools, any school that was above the state average, at the state average or above. They have about 16 schools. 12 of those decided to charter, despite the fact that they could have stayed with the district. But as this was taking place, they decided themselves that they wanted to charter, and so those schools became charters under the Orleans Parish School Board, and the board operates 4 schools. So you've got 2 boards, both chartering and districting, having direct operated and having charters, if that simplifies things for you, despite the fact I can't get the words out.
And you got the
That's
RSD in there, okay.
Yeah, that's helpful. And I guess one other distinction, thanks, Sarah, is that the sort of schools on the left, your left-hand side, that are under the RSD, both RSD charters and RSD state-run schools, are governed by Bessie. Okay, so that's a state board located 90 miles outside of New Orleans in Baton Rouge. So if you're a public school parent and your child attends one of those schools and you want to have a say in the school's governance, right? You have a grievance or a concern, you have to get in your car and drive 90 miles to talk to the Board of Elementary and Secondary Education in Baton Rouge.
Well, do these schools have boards? I mean,
Yes,
how do they?
every single one of them is incorporated
Well,
as a
they have-
nonprofit. And so the first recourse is obviously to go to the principal at the school, and then if you're not satisfied with that, you go to the nonprofit board. There are about 35 nonprofit entities that oversee all of the
But they're
charters
sort
in
of
the
privately
city.
appointed, and many community
There-
members feel there's not adequate
Are there
representation.
requirements under
There are-
Louisiana law to have a parental
There-
representative or multiple ones
No.
on the board? How does that?
No.
They're subject to the open meeting laws in the way that any public board in
But there's no
Louisiana is.
requirement to have a parent on the
No,
board?
there is not.
Their 990s are all.
Right, no, they're public insurance, but there's no, that's interesting, there is no requirement to have a parent on the
No.
board? Okay. So,
And in some instances, some schools actually have chosen to do so, and some have not, and some have had great experiences with having parent representatives on, and some are doing beautifully without, and some wish they, I mean, there's a nice mix of things taking place to be able to
I don't think it's
compare.
a nice mix. On the right-hand side are the schools under Orleans Parish, and those schools are governed by the Orleans Parish School Board, which is a locally elected entity. And so right now, what you have to understand is that these struggles over governance are quite immense, and that many Black working-class citizens in the city feel that they do not have a say in their public schools because they're being governed by a state entity in Baton Rouge, 90 miles away, right? And that's who's
and
controlling.
that actually tees up my next question.
Yeah.
So, and just to make sure I understand this right, the Orleans Parish has these 4 schools, which are magnet schools, and then it's got this set of 9 schools, which are charter schools.
12, yeah.
Okay, 12 schools. Sorry, I can't do math either, apparently.
No, that says
There's
9
9
there,
there,
but
yeah, okay.
there's-
Oh, okay. So, help us understand, if you're a parent, pre-storm, you went to your neighborhood school,
You had no choice.
yeah, unless you tested into one of these magnets, right? Is that?
Right.
Okay.
Correct.
Yeah.
So after the storm, now, and I don't mean the immediate aftermath of the chaos, but like now, this school year, so how does it work? What's your experience like as you're sort of thinking, like, if, say you're a parent of a rising kindergartner and you're trying to figure out, like, what does it actually look like for you?
This year will be the first year that one application process has been centralized. Until now, it's been very confusing.
So like a common application?
It's a very timely question. Literally, in the next several weeks, there will be a button pushed, and that randomized lottery will decide where you go. As a parent, you would go in and you'd fill out one application now.
Why a lottery? The school's oversubscribed?
Some are oversubscribed, some are not. So you have complete choice within the entire city. 90%, according to the Scott Cowan Institute for Research at Tulane, 90% of the parents surveyed are incredibly want choice, want to keep choice. 68% of the parents are saying that we
All
absolutely
right, so hang on.
Okay,
So
so-
hang on just a sec. So if I have complete choice, so I have choice of any of these schools if I'm a
No,
parent?
you don't. You don't. One thing is the Cowan Institute surveys, which they keep doing. This is the second one
Well, hang
they've
on, before I
done.
get to the survey, just a
Yeah.
sec. So if I'm a parent, theoretically, I have complete choice of any of these schools?
Theoretically.
And my next question is
Theoretically.
the geography of New Orleans,
There-
like, what's the realistic, like, how does
there's
that?
there's a caveat. There were CWAS magnet schools prior to the storm. Those have remained and been grandfathered. A couple of those have actually given up their admissions criteria, so we are actually less selective now than we were prior to
And are any of the
Katrina.
charters selective?
There are a handful of schools that are Orleans Parish, they're not in the Recovery School District, selective charters.
And,
But they-
hang on, and based on what?
Admissions, academic criteria. They
Okay.
existed prior to Katrina.
And what's the, and I know you have a slide just to show, what's the dispersion, because so if you can theoretically
Yeah.
choose from these schools, excluding the selective ones, but like in practical terms, in
Right.
terms of transportation and so forth, like how are parents experiencing a lot of choice, not a lot? What does
So
this
that,
look
yeah,
like?
that's why I had said theoretically, because there really isn't choice. So sort of advocates say that, it's this great system where parents have choice. Well, one, there are no more neighborhood public schools, okay? And you'll hear many advocates talk about open enrollment schools. Please be warned, open enrollment is not the equivalent of open access. Open enrollment in New Orleans means that traditional neighborhood boundaries of attendance no longer apply. That does not mean the schools are open access. Some of the schools, as Sarah rightly pointed out, do have formal admissions criteria. However, on the ground, there is a widespread understanding in the community that many of the schools that profess to be open access, in fact, have all kinds of informal barriers to entry. That could be anything from targeted recruitment campaigns, the fact that they have caps on how many students they'll take, so if a parent goes, the grade level's already capped, you can't get in. Most importantly, there's another class action lawsuit in New Orleans that is underway regarding discrimination against special education children. And here again, the charter schools in the Recovery School District have disproportionately lower numbers of special education children. The charter schools have approximately 8% special ed populations. That's an average. Some of the schools have 0 special education kids listed, so it varies. The RSD state-run schools, which are the traditional open access public schools, have approximately 13% special education kids. And so to say that parents have choice, clearly they don't, particularly parents of special needs children.
And we see that kind of disparity in a lot of places. Now, do the schools have any practices that would drive that? So for example, they don't use IEPs?
I actually need to correct that. The citywide average is 9% special ed and the RSD charters are at 8%.
And that's based on sources, please.
Yeah.
That was based on October 1 enrollment for this past school year.
Is that state data?
Yes.
I have it, I can dig it up in the
So
Cowan report.
But that's state data, so it's a little bit closer.
No.
And so what's happening, so before we get to achievement, like you said, it's sort of on the ground, people have heard this.
Right.
Like, look, on the ground, people have heard Elvis is alive. What's the
Yeah.
evidence? What's the
Yes.
evidence? Again, this is a serious charge, and I have no
Right.
tolerance for charter schools that skim.
Right.
What's the evidence that this is actually
Right, so here's the
happening?
evidence that is currently being heard in court. There's a federal civil rights lawsuit asserting that 4,500 kids of special ed status have been discriminated against, either denied entry into the schools of the Recovery School District or not offered a free and appropriate education or access to services and qualified personnel in the schools. They're being suspended in record numbers, upwards of 30%. Few brief examples from the lawsuit. A child in a wheelchair went to 6 charter schools and basically was told that either she couldn't be admitted because they didn't serve special needs kids or the schools were wheelchair inaccessible. A blind student of 8 years of age went to 8 charter schools. 5 said they would take his application but could not accommodate him. The 6th one said they would take him, but they were stretched thin as hell. And the 7th one said they had a great program, but it was a selective admission school, so he may not be admitted. He landed himself in the 8th school, and in the 8th school, this young boy, 8 years of age, who's blind, was given worksheets by his teacher to complete. Well, clearly that's not appropriate materials for a blind child, and it took the school months and months to order books on tape for this young boy. And so these are just some
Sir,
examples.
you want to respond?
Examples of how
Those are
school
pretty compelling.
choice is not open to all.
So I think the levels of special ed between the Recovery School District schools and the charter schools has leveled out. What I think is most astounding is that prior to Katrina in 2005, only 1 in 10 of the children with special needs in Orleans Parish, all schools, magnet schools, all schools, was on grade level. We've tripled that number, more than tripled that number of all students. So the academic outcomes that we're experiencing with kids, and these are all special needs kids across.
And we're going to go to academics in a sec, but
The vast
so
majority of those kids aren't even
Sarah, what's
graduating.
going on with special ed? I mean, so like, are there schools that are struggling with this, or struggling is a euphemism for not doing the right thing?
There are schools. There's a school in the Lower Garden District, Ash, that has become such. It's a charter school. It's become such a magnet for special needs kids that their percentage is somewhere. I have to double check. As my kids said, and I told you all already, I'm bad with numbers. It's like 20%. It has become known to being a place that services the special needs kids. There's another school out in the east, Mardell Early, a veteran Orleans educator, started her charter right after the storm, and she services and specializes in autistic kids. The charters have come together to really work to address these needs. Let me be very clear.
But are there some problems? I mean,
Segregating special ed kids in two schools, the whole intent.
Well, hang on,
Kristen, that's not what I'm, Dr. Buras, I'm sorry, that's not what I'm saying. Those are examples. There are schools who are about to get their wrists slapped through the one-app process.
After 7 years.
Because they have not had the same percentage of special needs kids that others have. I do think it's important to note Orleans Parish schools prior to Katrina, I experienced kids in special needs classrooms watching nothing but Jerry Springer all day long. This is a persistent, prevalent problem that we have experienced in New Orleans, not uncommon to other urban areas. And what is most, I think, encouraging for us is to see the dramatic gains and academic achievement that the special needs kids in the city of New Orleans have made. They still have a very far way to go.
and we'll talk about achievement, but it sounds like, are there some, I mean, is there any merit to this lawsuit? Are there some bad actors?
I don't know whether there's merit to the lawsuit.
Sorry.
We'll find out soon.
I don't think that's for me to judge. I think that that in the chaos of recreating a school system that was abysmal to begin with, did not do a good job of special needs prior, there have been problems. And there are folks that are diligently working to address those issues and concerns, and there are some that are actually excelling in their work, and there are others where there's still growth to be had.
But, you know, we can't talk about there are some that are excelling and there are some that's growth. This is a person's child. There's a federal law called IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, right? That says that special needs kids have a civil right to a free and appropriate education in the least restrictive environment. Now, you talk about 7 years of reform and we're only starting to deal with this issue. Imagine if you have a child in first grade, by now they're almost in middle school.
Well, I want to move to the data to let's see how, so
I guess
unfortunately, what I'm getting from both of you is I'm getting a lot of anecdotes. I want to see some data.
Well,
So let's talk
it's
about,
not
let's talk about, those were a
Yeah.
string of anecdotes, and I'm getting them from both of you. Let's move to some data. We got the data on special ed, but let's move to some data on performance. So you both have slides on the performance picture.
Right.
So what's going on? I think we still have Kristen's slides up because we were doing.
Those are mine.
These, okay. So because we were doing governance. Sorry, Sarah. So why don't we do it this way? Sarah, talk about the achievement, and Kristen, if you see things in the slide you don't think are right, talk about why. So what's going on? How should we be thinking about achievement in New Orleans post Katrina?
So what we've actually seen are some of the most dramatic gains in academic achievement for an urban school system in a very short amount of time. Considering that the very first year after the storm there really wasn't much school taking place, the heroic work that folks have done since then. As you'll see, only 35% of kids were on grade level in 2005. That's all students, all grades tested. And that has already risen to 56%. We recognize that that's nowhere near where we want to be, but that's a dramatic gain in getting kids on to performance. You see similar, pardon? The orange is 2005 pre-Katrina, yes sir, and the green is 2011 data. The African American students, similar gains, and then as I just referenced on the shorter graphs on the far right are the students with disabilities.
And given the turmoil that happened in the city, I mean, obviously these aren't all the same kids, that they're not, but like, how different are these two populations when we look at the orange bar and the green bar?
The population is smaller, but it is just as black and just as minority and the same numbers of free and reduced lunch numbers. In fact, it's slightly poorer and slightly slightly poorer now, more free and reduced lunch kids, but it's so nominal that we say that we equivalent to be the same.
Any other performance slides?
Yep, the next slide. I used to say this was our Lombardi trophy, but I'm not sure I should say that anymore. In 2000, the New Orleans data is on the bottom, the state data is on the top. We had consistently a gap of about 26 points, 23 points between the performance of schools. This is, again, all students, basic and above, which is the proficiency goal for all grades, all tests. And as you will see, we have taken that and we've cut the gap between the state and New Orleans, which is remarkable when you think about the challenges in the city, the population in the city, the poverty in the city, and it is down to a 10-point gap between the two. And it is rapidly improving at a much greater rate than anywhere else. In fact, the RSD is the #1 parish in the state for improvement. And we are on track to actually outperforming the state, for Orleans to be outperforming the state in the next few years if we continue this rapid improvement and the continuous cycle of improvement, which is a built-in mechanism of the system.
And I saw in the other room you have a slide on charters. Let's do that, then we'll go to
Okay.
Kristen. So what's going on charter? We talked about what's going on charter.
The next
if
one,
we can break
slide
it out just by
5.
charter performance.
Right in chronological order. Many of you all may be familiar with the study that was done by the Credo Institute of charters across the country in 2009 that actually showed that some of the charters were actually not driving performance as much, and charter advocates will say they're flaws, charter opponents will cheer it on. What we've actually had Credo do the same study again in New Orleans, and 3 times as many of the charters in New Orleans are receiving superior ratings.
And this
compared
was
to
a
the
study
national
where they matched kids and compared performance in charters to performance
they created virtual twins.
Right.
So it really did correct and account for demographics.
And the virtual
and special
twins
needs.
in this case were national virtual twins for you guys, not not Louisiana or New Orleans virtual twins?
They were feeder, any school in the state of Louisiana who
Louisiana
had a
twins.
child leave that school and go to a charter in New Orleans.
Okay, any others?
No.
All right.
Okay, slide 10, please. Thank you. So here's my alternative take on school achievement in New Orleans. The Recovery School District schools are a complete failure, okay? So here's the situation. Remember Act 35 that took the SPS school performance score and raised it from 60 to about 88, okay? Defined all the schools as failing and subsumed them under the RSD, okay? I like to explain it this way, that the success of New Orleans charter school movement has been legislatively contrived. And what I mean by this is the following, and I think you'll understand this quite clearly, that if you treat the standard of what constitutes success or failure like a ping pong ball, which the state legislature does, and continuously move it, that you can generate success or failure by shifting the definition. So in order to define schools as failing and take them over in 2005, the standard was 87.4. In 2009, the state legislature moved down the school performance score cutoff to 75. In 2010, they moved it down to 60, okay?
Is this on that same 200-point scale?
Yes, it is. Okay, so here's the takeaway, okay? That one, if you use the standard of 87.4 that was used to justify the takeover of failing schools, by that standard, SPS 87.4, the vast majority of RSD schools are failing and continue to fail. But that's a high standard, right? I mean, higher than the 60, which was the baseline in 2005. So let's ratchet it down. Let's ratchet it down to the 2012 SPS, which is 75. By the SPS cutoff of 75, it still remains true that the vast majority of schools in the Recovery School District still are failing. Now, lest you say I am appropriating data in ways that I should not. This particular slide is based on data that you have at your disposal. You can go to the Recovery School District or Louisiana Department of Education website, because this year they started assigning letter grades to the schools, allegedly to make information more available to parent consumers. Of course, it's in a 60-page Excel spreadsheet, and it's statewide, and it takes someone with a PhD to try to meander their way through it, right? But what you come to find out when you look at the New Orleans RSD schools are these particular statistics, which is that 100%, this is 2011 data, 100% of the 15 state-run schools in the RSD have been assigned a letter grade of D or F. 79% of the 42 charter schools in the RSD have been assigned a letter grade of D or F. And I'm getting these statistics, the bullet points, from an organization in New Orleans called Research on Reforms. But these bullet points are based on.
Okay, so both these things can't be true.
Right.
So I've got a
So-
quick question, wait, to help us think about it. So it says RSD schools that have been open for less than 3 years are not assigned a letter grade.
Right.
How many schools are we talking about there, just for starters?
About 10%, I think.
10% of?
Well, because unless you have at least 2 years of consecutive
Right,
data.
of course, but I'm
then
just
you're
asking,
not-
like, how many schools, based on this, the slide we just saw, we have a sense of number of schools, how many schools wouldn't be getting a letter grade here?
I don't have that number with me.
Okay, all right.
But it can calculate
It's
it.
like between 5 and 7.
Between 5 and 7 schools?
Yeah.
Okay, so not that many. Okay,
So-
so how do we help us square this?
Well, here's
Yeah,
the
go
thing.
ahead, Sarah, let's let Sarah respond, because this
Okay.
is, both these things can't be true, and I want you guys to
So,
sort it out before we leave.
I have to say that, in all honesty, the Louisiana changed and raised the standards. So the cutoff grade
from what to what?
for a failing school was initially set for the Recovery School District at 60. It's on the track and is going up every year and rising to 75. So we actually raised the standard. There's some things getting mixed and confused. The law for Act 35, the cutoff was an 87.5, the state average. That was purely for which schools would be designated to go into the Recovery School District. The definition of a failing school was set at 60 and is currently rising. And so if you actually look in the 2005 data, 62% of schools attended 62% of students attended a failing school. If you hold that same measure of 60, then it goes down to 10%. If you actually, and the state did change the definition of failing, you can look at it, it's very clear. We're actually raising our standards, which is absolutely what we want to do for kids and for their futures and for their outcomes. And by that measure, and you apply
And
the
they're
same
raising, when you say
data,
raise the standard, they're raising
the
the point
definition
on
of a
this,
failing
on this
school.
200-point index?
Correct, it's going up from 60 to 75. The
And
87
Kristen, you
is
say
a
it's not going
separate
up.
thing.
Well, I guess what I'm
The definition by that measure, right, in 2005, 78% of the students were attending a failing school, and it's down to 40. So it is true, you have to know which standard, and you have to hold it consistent over the 2 years. But what we are expecting of our students, we're actually driving the bar up, and that's largely driven by that charter school performance and the gains the outstanding gains in academic achievement that they have had.
Gains or games, okay? G-A-M-E-S, because it's truly a ping pong. I mean, it is difficult to keep up with the
But hang
Louisiana
on, but
State Legislature.
it is, God knows that's true. But
But
is
what I'm
it,
saying
but
is
but
you
is it rising? That's,
No, what I'm saying is this, you cannot use one standard to define schools as failing and take them over, then ratchet down the standard and say that charter schools are producing success. You've changed the standard.
But I'm
The
confused, how,
the standard has gone up. I mean,
Kristen, has the,
Okay,
has the definition gone up? That's what I'm
Well, the definition
confused.
went up, then it went down, and now it's slowly rising, but it hasn't hit above 75 SPS, and what you need to know is that SPS 75
So where is it
level-
right now?
At SPS 75 level, that means 54% of the students in that SPS 75 school, 54% of those kids are below grade level. Now, what you'll find is that reformers who are advocating charter schools like to talk in terms of percentage increases. They like to talk about growth because they don't want to talk about absolute numbers, because the absolute numbers are completely dismal. And this is the thing, recently Mary Landrieu, who is a state senator, gathered members of her colleagues across the country as part of an event for the Senate Public Charter School Caucus. At the center of that particular gathering was a report that Ms. Usdin's organization, New Schools for New Orleans, put out. And based on that report, New Orleans charter school experiment was touted as a national model. My question is, on what basis is New Orleans experimentation with charter schools a national model when even after 7 years of reform, 54% of the kids at SPS 75, and the vast majority of those schools are rated as such, D's and F's, right, continue to fail? That is hardly a standard of success.
So, Sarah, I want you to respond to that.
I guess what I'm saying is,
Hang on,
some growth maybe,
I want to hear
but
Sarah.
I don't want to talk about gradations of absolute failure. I want to talk, Andy, seriously.
Yeah, but
Sarah,
whoa, wait.
I want to talk
but
about
I still can't get.
reforms.
I hear you, and we're going to get to that. And you're going to get in just a second. But I want to ask. So I'm still completely confused, and so maybe the audience isn't, because it's a Harvard audience. But I'm still completely confused. It sounds like the standard is going up. Can we all? Is that yes?
No.
You've been saying that they're lowering the standard, but it sounds like it's actually the standard for what constitutes a failing school is actually going up. Yes or no?
Slightly.
Okay, so yes, that's slightly a yes. Okay.
But it's not the same standard that was used to define failure in 2005.
So Sarah, how do you want to respond to this point that at this, it's definitely not the same standard, but it sounds like it's moving up.
But this is a little known fact, Andy, and so when people look at the numbers and they talk about these immense rates of growth, what people don't understand, the general public doesn't understand, many parents in New Orleans don't even understand because it's not widely publicized that the standard of what constitutes success and failure shifts almost every year.
But it's shifting in the direction of moving up.
Well, it depends on where you want to talk about the trajectory. Again, it was 60 in 2005. Then after Katrina, it went up to 87.4. Then in 2009, it went to 75. In 2010, it went to 60. And that's actually interesting because in 2010, when it ratcheted way down to 60, which is when 66% of kids are below grade level, that year 2010 was the year that there was going to be a public hearing as to whether or not the schools were going to be retained by the recovery school district. And so by ratcheting the standard of failure that low, you generate higher levels of success. You can say the RSD is more successful and therefore produce an argument for retaining those schools under the recovery school district.
Okay, so Sarah, wait. Sarah gets to respond now. So, Sarah, two things I want you to respond to. One, this issue of sort of how should we think about the number of kids who still aren't where they need to be and what's going on there. And then second, help us understand sort of these numbers that are bouncing around and like in plain English, like what's the response? How should we be thinking about this?
I can call back up the graphs and show you the steady rise in numbers, and it is for every.
And those are students, not schools. So we do have a little bit of a unit of analysis.
Schools. Well, if you would like, if you'd like to see the schools numbers, if you could call up slide 6 on my slides. So this shows the number of academically unacceptable schools. This is using the definition. Let me make sure I've got it right. This is the current definition of a failing school, where the score has gone up from the original 60, it's gone up. We had 70, if you use that definition, we had 78% of the kids were in academically unacceptable schools, and that number has declined to 40%, with 51% now in.
And here's the thing I think we're all hung up on. So has the line for what constitutes academically acceptable and unacceptable, it's obviously changed. Has it gotten more demanding or less demanding?
It has gotten more demanding.
But at that more demanding rate of SPS 75, 54% of kids are still below grade level. So
yes, 54% are still.
That's SPS 75 means that, and it's based on a formula of leap and attendance.
Currently on grade level, we have 56% of our kids in all tests, all grades.
56, okay.
56%.
Okay,
that is rising from a 2005 level of 35.
Sarah,
so
is that RSD schools or is that an aggregate of RSD?
This is citywide of every school in Orleans.
That's problematic, and this is what the reformers do. They don't disaggregate data. So for example, very often when they produce numbers of success, they aggregate data for Orleans Parish, which means the following. Rather than saying this is the performance level of RSD schools and this is the performance of Orleans Parish schools, they combine RSD and Orleans Parish schools into one set. The reason that's problematic is this. You'll recall that I said that the 16 schools, or the few schools that Orleans Parish was left with, were the highest performing schools, right? I mean, because the vast majority were taken over, which means that if you include the
Right.
ones under Orleans Parish School with highest
So,
performing
Sarah, what happens if
in
you
your
break-
data set, you're going to artificially upwardly
Absolutely.
skew
So what
the
happens
numbers.
if, Sarah, what happens if you break those numbers out? What do you
Well,
get?
It's
I would
ugly.
argue
That's
actually that those kids were part of the school system prior, so the best accurate picture we can get of apples to apples, because those schools were part of the school system prior. So one, I think it's important to note that we're looking at the entire city.
Right,
and
but
the
if you just
No,
break out the
then
RSD,
no.
do you get a different picture?
You have the.
Yes, you do.
Yeah, you have the greatest gains have taken place in the RSD
Right.
charters and in the RSD in the city, and they
Had the
ranked
far- they had
number
the-
one for improvement in the state above all
And they had
other
the farthest to
parishes.
go.
But Andy, they're
Correct.
gains within a grid. I like to explain it this way. They are gains within a standard of absolute failure. So we're talking about gradations of absolute failure. And I don't want to talk about
Well,
that.
it sounds like about half the kids are still not well served. So, hang on.
Yeah,
You're going to get just a sec.
yeah.
A couple of closing questions. I want to try to get a few from the audience, but this has been really lively and good. So, so what I want to ask you very
Yes.
explicitly, has there been any improvement here? When you look at, so I don't think anybody,
Yes.
at least when I look at these numbers and see 56%, that still sounds like 44% of kids are in a really bad way. And so I don't think anyone thinks this is nearly acceptable. But has there been any improvement since
Yeah.
the storm?
It's hard to say because you have informal selective admissions processes that are happening on the ground. What's happening is that the RSD
But
charter.
a lot of these schools are lottery. Like we hear this, but like I'm not gonna. I just want to sort of. Has there been any sort of? It's hard to say. Like, can you say anything good has happened? And you're gonna get one more bite at the
Yeah.
apple. So.
Not much.
All right, and Sarah, I'm gonna flip the question on you. Like, what's the biggest thing that's really not working in New Orleans, and what's the biggest problem with this? I mean, where are the critics right?
We are working to address the issues to make sure that that the confusion of the system is one that parents can navigate. We heard that loud and clear, and we're hopeful that with the new application system this spring that will be addressed. Like other urban areas, we're working to ensure that special needs kids. I don't know any place in the country that serves special needs kids at the highest levels across the board in the way that we should. I actually feel a very palpable commitment to solving that issue in the city of New Orleans from district as well as charter schools, and we've already had tremendous gains in serving those students, and I think we will continue to do so. And I think the other issue is I don't know a place that actually really does have a level playing field for all kids of all backgrounds, of all zip codes, of all income levels, that really competes nationally and internationally. And the sense that you have in New Orleans now getting to work with these families and with the educators and the people running the schools really is that we are working to get to that place where it won't be 56%, it'll be in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and that we hardly talked about the unique mechanism that we've gotten away from these large monolithic bureaucracies running schools, and we've empowered educators.
Yeah,
and we're holding them.
That sense of empowerment
Actually, and
is not.
I want to follow up on that. Well, hang on just a sec. You're going to get, but
Yeah.
so that's my next question for you, Sarah, and one of the last ones. Just how do we know? I mean, there is a lot of outside money here. There's a lot of national foundations. This is, rightly or wrongly talked about as a national model. How do we know this isn't just a petri dish for people to sort of try their favorite ideas? I go
back.
Talk about parents and so forth, and I mean, how do we?
Yep.
With just millions of dollars of outside money coming in and so forth, how should we think about that?
I think that the slides that I showed about the gains are remarkable to see that. I mean, we never saw that kind of growth for students and their academic outcomes and achievement prior, ever. And the thing is for those of us who were there the very first year, we saw a little bump and we got encouraged, but it really has been consistent.
But is there a risk? Is there a risk here? I mean, is there anything to this idea that with all this change going on, that parts of the local community may be getting disenfranchised?
I'm going to separate your question because you asked me two in one.
That's what moderators do.
I think the risk is for folks to think that there's a one-size-fits-all. What has happened for us has been, quite honestly, I think, this phenomenal, I know Dr. Buras doesn't agree, but this phenomenal alignment of setting a vision of what's possible for students. We had the help of the state, we had the help of the mayor, we've had incredibly hard work from teachers and kids and families, and it's been it's not a one-size-fits-all. So yes, New Schools for New Orleans put out the Guide to Education Reform. They're out there for you all to pull apart and love or hate, tear up. We welcome your feedback. And a fear in doing that is that people will think, oh, this is a silver bullet. We just go do A, B, and C, and we're going to get this. And it's way more nuanced than that, about really understanding kids and families and getting in there and getting great educators and holding them accountable. We're one of the only places in the country that has consistently shut down charter schools for poor academic behavior. We've kicked out operators that were not performing well.
No.
And most encouraging to me is to see that 78% of the charter parents and 68% of the parents citywide believe that schools are dramatically better, and they are the #1 consumer of what's happening, and that's why we're there, is to educate their children.
So I've got a closing question for you on the same theme, but you
Yes.
said charter schools haven't been closed down?
Right, so slide 7, please, if you don't mind. So just
Quickly.
two quick points. One is that I think reformers invoke this notion of we have been visionary, we are making progress. Who is the we?
Well, hang on, you're going to get to that. You're going to get an answer to that.
yeah.
I'm asking you, right, have charter schools been closed down? When Sarah said that, you said that they haven't.
Yes,
So this is easy. This is
Right,
easy. Have charter
right.
schools been closed down?
Between 1995 and 2009, only a handful of charter schools, and that's way predating Katrina, right? Only a handful, less than 10 charter schools have been closed. Okay, and here's the thing, here in my hand.
Okay, how many since the storm?
I'm going to tell you. I'm holding the Louisiana Legislative Auditor's Report from September of 2011, so this is data produced by the state, indicating that, one, the Office of Parental Options and the Recovery School District, quote, did not effectively monitor its charter schools.
Okay, well, hang on. I can help you on that because we actually were hired by the state
Well,
to
I
look
guess
at their
I'm
charter
saying
school
you
policies,
can't-
and they're terrible.
Right, so you
They did a
can't-
terrible job of
right, so
monitoring.
my-
That's not my question.
Andy.
Have any been shut down? You said they haven't. Their monitoring and oversight is terrible, and they need to
Right,
fix
so
it.
you can't, shutting down a school is dependent on the oversight and monitoring process.
But
So
just have any been shut down, even within the context of that weak system?
one or two.
How many? Does any? This is
One or two.
This seems to me to be like a knowable number.
One or two.
Sarah?
The Free School handed in their charter, Sojourner Truth has handed in their charter. There are
All the schools have Ds
3
and
that
Fs
are up for
and none have
transformation this year
virtually-
because of academic
And are there
performance.
some, looking at the data, it seems
Yeah.
like there are some that should probably be either closed down. Yeah.
But they won't
Absolutely.
be. But they won't be. I mean,
They're-
because this is
they
not
are-
about academic performance. It's about controlling money, and it's about
hang
contracts.
on. Well, this is good. You're getting to one of my last questions. So I was struck when I read your article. One of the most interesting points that jumped out is you cited Paul Hill, and you cited
Yes.
Paul, a nationally known conservative,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Okay. Well, Paul actually worked for Muskie, so that's why that kind of jumped out. I mean, in these parts, people know that Ed Muskie is really not much of a conservative. So, and he's actually a Democratic donor and has never voted for
Well, so is
Republican.
Mary
But
Landrieu,
hang on. So
yeah.
that's why that passage jumped out at me as I was
Yeah.
reading. And you said you compared him to Milton Friedman. I thought this was interesting. And you said that Hill says a portfolio of schools should have as its foremost goal making sure there's enough quality schools
Yes,
for everyone.
yes.
And Milton Friedman says the foremost purpose of corporations is to maximize shareholder value. So both those things I think are unambiguously true. I've heard Paul Hill say that, and Milton Friedman obviously espoused that idea. But what I didn't understand, and I would hope
Yes.
if you could, like, what is that, how does that help us think about what's happening down here? I just didn't quite understand, like, and so this point on empowerment and so forth, how does this idea of Milton Friedman wants to maximize shareholder value, Paul Hill says we should make sure there's enough quality schools through a portfolio model? Like, where's the equivalence there? I didn't get it, and I felt like that seemed to be like kind of at the heart of your argument, so help us understand that.
Okay. I'm not sure I completely understand your question, but I think what you're asking is
How is sort of this idea of having a portfolio of schools, how is it equivalent to what Milton Friedman was talking about? and sort of maximizing shareholder value, because your whole sort of critique on sort of that this is really about sort of capitalism and about disempowering people is sort of predicated on that. I didn't see the connection between the two, and I was struck at the invocation of Paul.
Yeah.
And so help us, and that seems, a lot of your argument here seems to be,
Right.
this is about, I asked
Right,
Sarah
about
about
marketization.
disempowering, you know, in terms of the foundations and so forth, like, so help us understand, like, how does how do those two things actually fit
Right.
together?
So, again, I'll draw on the words of a community member because I feel like community voices haven't been adequately considered in this dialogue. One of the community members said the following, and it responds to your question about the marketization of schools. I explained the dismissal of teachers and the school system as a hostile takeover, a power struggle between those who wanted control of the millions of dollars that were involved in education in New Orleans Parish. This was primarily controlled by African Americans who were able to allot contracts. The powers that be were not pleased with that. They were looking for years to find ways to wrest control back from the district because their district served a majority African American population. And so I guess what I'm saying is that, you know, the schools have basically been taken over by private charter school management companies, okay, by human capital service providers. You've got millions of dollars coming in from the Broad Foundation, from the Gates Foundation, Fisher and Walton. Many of these millions of dollars have gone to new schools for New Orleans, and so forth. So there's huge power and money behind this movement, and who's going to control the assets that are the New Orleans public schools? And that, of course, includes the school budgets, right? Which can be used to allocate contracts for transportation, for food, and for all kinds of other things, which Patricia Burt's called hidden markets, okay? And simultaneously, this is what's significant, is that this marketization is justified because we're told that the schools will now be run more efficiently and more effectively because of market discipline. But do we know that to be true? No, because like I said, the state legislative auditor also found that the RSD was not effectively monitoring the financial health or the legal and contractual compliance of the vast majority of its charter schools. And what they found was that
and what they and we
But-
were hired by the state to do
but
this. So
this is
and
what-
it's not as bad as you say. It's even worse than you say. So let me just staying on this. So when you talk to these people and you sort of challenge them on this, like
Yes.
what's the response? Because there are all these groups down there and so forth. So like when you interview them, like what do they say? When you say that this is about takeover, it's about disempowering people and so forth. What's the response?
So I had the chance to interview various representatives of the Cowan Institute at Tulane University, which sort of is, in many ways, is sort of an outgrowth of the Bring New Orleans Back Commission, which Scott Cowan, who's the president of Tulane University, headed, and they had put out a report in January of 2006 calling for the first all-charter school district in the nation. And now Tulane University has sort of this public education institute where they sort of comment upon and guide policy. And
what do they say?
What they say is this, you know, when I interviewed folks, there was a sense that the problem was with veteran educators and schools of education, right? And that it was sort of touted over there that, you know, we don't have people in education here. Everyone here has an MBA, you know, and we understand what it means to franchise schools. And so it's very unapologetic. One, there's a sense, which is merely asserted, not based on evidence, but merely asserted, that the market will be good for the schools. And secondarily, to be quite frank, even if it's not, who cares? And this is the subtext.
And they said that?
No. I'm saying that's my interpretation, because if this was
But
truly about student achievement.
But they didn't say that. I just want to be clear. That's a pretty strong. They didn't.
No, what I'm saying is that the subtext is who cares, because when you compare rhetoric to reality, there are gross disjunctures, right? If we really cared about student achievement, would we be touting experimental reform in New Orleans when more than half of the kids are still below grade level? As I said before.
So, and what do the people, so that's the Cowan people, and they're not hearing it to themselves. What do the people at NSNO say when you interviewed them?
I didn't interview them. And in fact, I don't know if Sarah remembers, but when I was at the Cowan Institute, I approached members of New Schools for New Orleans and Sarah with my informed consent form, and there was a sense that they would not be speaking to me. And so part of my research has been to try to, you know, discuss the issues with myriad stakeholders.
But you didn't interview them?
No.
What about TNTP?
No. But what I did do is I've been doing this research for years. And by the way, I am a native New Orleanian.
No, I get that. I'm just trying to
yeah.
figure. So the Cowan people, no one else. You didn't interview anybody else?
I've interviewed myriad stakeholders over the past 6 or 7 years.
But these groups, I mean, these groups that you sort of feel are. What about the foundations? Have you talked to the Broad Foundation or Gates?
No, but in terms of gathering data on those, there's multiple, you know, forms of web-based data, annual reports, scholarly, documentation of where the monies are going. You know, all of this is tax reportable. So, I mean, have I interviewed Bill Gates or the people at the Gates Foundation? No, I haven't. But why do you ask?
Well, it's interesting. So, and this, I guess, a good way to. It seems like there seems to be a lack of as I look at this. I mean, one, I'm left with like I actually want to dig into the data even more. It's confusing, and there seems to be just a lack of communication between sort of I'm not sure need to be warring parties. I was sort of struck at how when you talk about the Orleans, neither of you made the Orleans Parish School Board sound like the kind of place where I'd the kind of people I'd want to have my kids before the storm with some of these decisions, and yet there didn't seem to be like a lot of dialogue. So I've been struck at the sort of listening to this conversation sort of at the lack of dialogue, and that has jumped out at me. Two things. One on wrap up on charter schools. Kay Merseth asked me to tell you guys, and there are refreshments. There is an event. There are 43 students enrolled in a course that's taught here on charter schools at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. They're having an event tonight, and again, did I mention there are refreshments? Apparently it's a big it's a big display. You can talk to these students. Of the 43 students, 32 have opted to develop school models and school plans, and so you can go over there and talk to them. And they will share those. And again, there are refreshments, and that's right across the street in Gutman. So that's the first thing. Second, please join me in thanking our panelists. I'm going to volunteer them. They haven't volunteered themselves. I'm going to volunteer them in two ways. One, because this was a really lively and interesting conversation, and I hope you guys enjoyed it. I did learn a lot. It's a very interesting and obviously a very important issue, and I mean, we could do 5 more forums on this, and I hope we do. They're going to stick around, though, so you can ask them some questions, and so I'm volunteering them for that, and I'm also volunteering them in the interest of time. If you want to follow up with them, they'll make themselves available via email and so forth if you want to have additional follow-up. But thank you guys for being such a good audience.
Thank you.
Thank you guys. That was great.
Thank you, Anne.